My final elective was a course on modeling complex systems, whereas the final project I had the opportunity to connect it back to fighting games. I want to run through the original project and then share the revamped version afterwards and what as we as competitors can take away from it. Now, the model itself is a series of simulated tournaments where each player follows one of 7 different strategies across events and will switch between 4 characters according to their strategy. The simulation starts with equal representation of characters and strategies. The tournaments are random seeded single elimination, then after a fixed number of tournaments a balance match occurs and the cycle repeats. Since this is a toil example with only 4 characters, the matchup chart is pretty small, and this little triangle to the right is what we base the simulation off of. Before we start the very first tournament, we randomly adjust this matchup chart, as although many devs tried their best to release a fair game, that doesn't mean it's perfectly fair upon release. Players in the simulation weigh their options according to the absolute matchup chart. This is the theoretical matchup split between any 2 characters. If 2 players piloting different characters had the exact same skill level and experience, and then fought each other, how often would each character win? What is the win percent between character A and character B if we controlled for skill? We already talk about matchups this way, saying, oh, this matchup is 6-4, but these are our own approximations of the game and don't necessarily reflect the absolute or true matchup ratio. I'm probably one of the only people in the world investigating fighting games this way, and I needed a term to differentiate between the true theoretical matchup split and community consensus around matchups. We are generally making our judgments around a matchup on a mix of both observed results and game knowledge. Sometimes we get things wrong, and a hero shows just how strong a weak character really is. Since this is a computer simulation, I can control for skill and have who wins coming down to the likelihood one character wins over the other, which is a lot less fun than the real world, which has many more factors contributing to the odds of each player winning. A lot of our tournaments are open bracket events, potentially without seeding. You have no idea who you're going to face round 1. Being sent to the loser's bracket early means you have to play more games and have more chances to run into an unfavorable matchup. Be it a bad character matchup, which is mostly what we care about in this project, or running into Taquito round 2 at EVO. So having an average win percent above 50% will let you play the odds better, at least for a character pairing. I can't save you from Taquito. Last thing, before we get into the data, I want to go over some assumptions I had when making this. Players are of equal skill, we kind of already talked about that. Players are equally skilled with each character, so there's no penalty for switching characters. Yes, this differs slightly from reality, but I'll get more into this later. Another assumption is that devs make their balance patches according to observed results. They assume that the players have it all figured out and whatever character wins the most events must be the strongest character overall. The players do have it all figured out, and they make their character choices according to the absolute matchup chart. The simulation begins with an equal representation of characters, as we do not want to manipulate what character wins by over-representing one character. The simulation begins with equal representation of strategies for the same reason, and the final assumption is that the balance patch itself is random. Potentially the weakest character could get no changes. The original project, we looked at the results from 3 different simulations, and this is the first one where we can see the aggressive counterpick strategy perform the best. This is one of our dynamic strategies that actually switch characters mid-set, and as the name implies, they switch to whatever character does best against the character they just lost a game to. In reality, this is not as common, as characters themselves often have a lot of depth, making this strategy harder to commit to. Additionally, roster size can also reduce the feasibility of using the strategy. It's hard to be the best in the world with every single character in the game. And for full transparency, I had a bias going into this project thinking the aggressive counterpick strategy would be the best strategy. But as you see, that's not exactly what happened. The second model, we update the game more frequently. There are fewer tournaments for developers and players alike to see results. The aggressive counterpick strategy got dumpstered by anti-meta and anti-bandwagon, who were closely followed by the meta players, which, as the name implies, the meta players pick the meta character. After a tournament concludes, they switch to whatever character has the best average win percent according to the absolute matchup chart. The third model, we were looking at less frequent patches, where anti-meta ended up performing the best again. And overall, anti-meta was the best performing in the original project, but it was fairly close between the top 3 strategies. Anti-meta, who just counterpicked the meta pick, anti-bandwagon, who counterpicked the bandwagoners, and the meta players who just pick whoever is strongest in a vacuum. That's great, but let's give it more context. Model 2 had the most frequent patches, it was more dynamic, and there were fewer opportunities to see a long-term advantage emerge, which we loosely see with Model 2 having a smaller standard deviation. It had the smallest spread of data, which roughly tells us that there was not as much of an advantage between picking one strategy over another. Models 1 and 3 were both fairly similar, with Model 3 having the largest standard deviation, indicating a larger spread in data. It could be that the highs were higher or the lows were lower, or in this case, a mix of both. Now that was the original project, and I want to address some of the weaknesses of the original, including a little bit of code. First, I want to mention that rebalancing was random. One character would be the target of the nerf, whatever character won the most events, which hopefully is not the only evidence developers use when making changes. And the balancing itself picks 2 of the target character's 3 different matchups, and makes one average win percent worse by 2%, reduces another matchup's average win percent by 1%, and the third is left unchanged. The mirror match is not adjusted, as that is always going to be 50%. Because this is subject to RNG, the best character is not always the target of the patch, and the worst character is not always going to be helped with the patch. This method is somewhat naive and doesn't actually consider the shape of the matchup chart, it just tries to dethrone the king. Now, I also want to address some unintended behavior in the simulation that I left in. There is this character lag whenever a patch occurs. Generally what's going on is players are picking their potentially new characters after a tournament concludes. But if this is the end of a patch cycle, going into the following event they have outdated character choices. They're locked into characters from that previous patch. I considered this a feature and not a bug, as there is some adjustment period in a new patch, although I kinda want to remedy this. The dual mains and aggressive counterpick players reference the current absolute matchup chart during tournaments, so they actually experience character lag in a different way. When they switch characters, they won't switch again until they lose again, even between rounds of a tournament. So you might win round 1 by counterpicking into an objectively weaker character, but then you're setting yourself up to get a bad pairing in round 2. So this definitely diverges from reality a little bit, but also, it's a lot of work to fix and I'm doing this shit for free. Now, I was also a little unsatisfied with the rigor of the original and wanted to better capture the strategic benefit, if any, for picking one strategy over another. I felt that although the total number of events and patch cycles were a decent approximation, I wanted to see what happens if we view these strategies across multiple runs. The dual main players did not have every possible combination of 2 characters, so I added the combinations that were not originally included, as if there's some ideal combination of 2 characters, then one of the dual mains will have it. However, that means there were more dual mains than the other strategy, so I duplicated the others so there was an equal representation. I also ran each updated model 10 times and collected results from all 10. This is essentially that baseline model run 10 times with different starting seeds, and we aggregate all of the results. Where we see Anti-Bandwagon performing best, additionally I've included the standard deviations you can compare with the other models. In Model 2, Anti-Bandwagon plummeted to the bottom in this more volatile environment, and maybe that has something to do with character lag, but that would also apply to the meta players, which were the best performing. It is closely followed by aggressive counterpick, and maybe that's due to their dynamic character lag not being as important as the other kind of character lag in the more frequent patch environment. Model 3 is the lower frequency model, so people are waiting longer for patches and the standard deviation is higher than the high frequency model we just saw, but it's still lower than the baseline. I would have thought with the lower frequency of balance patches there would be more time to see strategic benefits emerge, which I thought would then result in a larger rift in performance between the best and the worst, but that is not the case here, and maybe that's due to variance. If we look at the overall performance across all 3, we see meta does the best. And this total performance statistic I get from adding the top 3 finishes, which include wins, and then add wins again, getting this value here. Why would I count wins twice? Because CVT did it first, following first place is roughly double that of second. The other things I think are important to note here are the close performance between aggressive counterpick, dual main, and bandwagon. I'd also like to note the somewhat big drop off between anti-bandwagon and anti-meta. I wanted the simulation to have as many things held constant as possible, and then have the rest be unbiased RNG, and then try to account for variance by running the simulation multiple times. If I were to do it over, I would remove character lag and have it be a double elimination bracket. However, with those changes, I feel it is more likely to confirm my bias of aggressive counterpick being the best strategy in a vacuum, even if it is hard to implement in the real world. I do not think I would introduce a penalty for switching to a new character, in part because it's almost impossible to quantify a standard drop in performance. Not every player has the same background and is going to find the same difficulty switching from one character to another. Additionally, switching between similar characters is not as dramatic as going from Zangief to Guile. Additionally, the goal of this was to evaluate the effectiveness of each character switching strategy, and penalizing switching felt counterintuitive. I also did not include every possible player philosophy around what character to choose, but I'd like to think it was a fair split. If I had more strategies on hand, I would include those too. Now, whenever the meta player wins an event, a weird dynamic happens in this simulation. All the bandwagon players go into the next tournament and all play the meta character. All the anti-meta players were already playing the counterpick, but now all the anti-bandwagon players are too. Suddenly, a massive portion of the tournament attendees are playing the meta character or the anti-meta character. So round 1, there are decent odds the anti-meta and anti-bandwagon players will be paired with a favorable matchup or the mirror. What I'm taking away from this is the importance of finding the meta. Whoever can more accurately approximate the absolute matchup chart has a tangible advantage. We generally stick to matchups being described as whole integers, like 6-4, or maybe include halves saying a matchup is 5.5, 4.5, when the actual split might be 5.2, 4.8, and having the actual matchup values for all matchups means you know what characters have an average win percent above 50% and which have an average win percent below 50%. If you can improve your odds of getting a favorable matchup in an open bracket event that might have hundreds of entrants, why wouldn't you? Alternatively, you can just skill gap everyone and have the advantage always be in your favor. However, you don't actually need to know the true matchup values to improve your odds. If you have a good enough approximation of character strength but a really good understanding of what characters people are playing, you can get an edge that way. If your character pairs well into the 4 most popular characters at an event scale, not just top 8, you can help set yourself up for success round 1 of a tournament. If you survived however many minutes of nerd speak this ends up being, hopefully you found it valuable. If you subscribe, that helps out a ton, as that lets me know you think it's cool. Or if you don't feel like subscribing but still want to help the channel out, leave a comment saying prank 'em, John. Or if you have your own player philosophy around picking competitive players, one that I haven't included, and that could be a philosophy for any game, I'd love to hear it. Editor John here. I wanted to include a brief addendum for this. This is all assuming you have both equal skill and experience with each matchup. So if you are unfamiliar with the matchup, say a not as popular character or a perceived low tier, there's this sort of advantage you get from playing an unpopular character because people don't have the familiarity. Although in a vacuum, the character may not be objectively as strong as more popular characters, but because other people don't have that experience, you can potentially find an advantage that way. There's a gap in knowledge that your opponent doesn't have about your character, and that could be the way you get your advantage. Even if, once your opponent knows about your character and what it can do, it becomes much less effective. There's kind of a short-term benefit to playing, I would say, a less popular character.